This game is a little different than the games that have been talked about otherwise today, in that it's not really a competition. It's more designed as an individual learning exercise in which students are encouraged to explore and experiment and even fail, and then go back and try something different. What I'm talking about is CyberCIEGE. CyberCIEGE is a network security simulation that's packaged as a video game. Students create and defend networks from virtual attackers. They have also virtual users who have goals to access assets within the environment. And the student has to provide software services and applications to those virtual users so they can get their work done. By facilitating access to assets for the legitimate users, the student also introduces potential risk of attack by attackers. So in the game, we have virtual attackers that are motivated by the value of the different assets that are in the game. Some assets might cause an attacker to be motivated to disclose the asset. Other assets might have integrity as a motivation, or denial of service as a motivation. Within the game, the simulated kinds of attacks include things like finding vulnerabilities in applications that have not been patched, Trojan horses, trapdoors, wiretaps, physical security, even bribery of your users. The CyberCIEGE game, its simulation, has been described in several papers over the years, including its potential value in education. And there's even been a few papers written on attempts to evaluate the efficacy of CyberCIEGE. Those papers and the game itself are available at our website, which can be found by Googling CyberCIEGE using any number of variations of its spelling. So I'm not going to talk about those things so much today. What I'm going to do is actually show you the mechanics of designing a CyberCIEGE scenario. We've built dozens of scenarios. You can go off and build your own. You can customize the ones that we've built. And we do that using this tool that's up here that you probably cannot read, but I'll point to it because it helps my nerves. So this is the tool. It's a forms-based tool that we use to build specific scenarios. This is a scenario that is intended to teach students about network filters. Fairly simple, straightforward scenario. And within this tool, I have all the different elements that make up a CyberCIEGE scenario. Things like enterprise assets, things like the users themselves, user goals. And so I put all these things together using a series of forms. I then compile them into a language that our game engine consumes. And the result is the actual scenario, which we will see here. So from my development environment, I'm going to launch the game. A student will use a different interface to launch the game. But that comes up pretty well. So I learn at the beginning of this simulation that I'm working for a company called TirePly. They make innovative car tire designs and sell them to large tire manufacturers. And here's one of our virtual worlds. And I've got this user here in a virtual office space. And if I just start my simulation, right away my user is angry. He starts banging on the keyboard. And if I look up here, I see that I'm losing money quickly. He's unhappy. And so my problem is that I've given this user a goal. That is, he needs to access some assets in order to do his job. And he's not achieving that goal right now, and that's why he's so angry. So if I click on the user and learn something about what it is this user's trying to do, I see he needs to do web research and access some research database. I also see he's actually the boss's son and just wants to surf the web. And if I don't get him on the web pretty quick, I'm probably going to lose my job. So down here, I see more detail about what his actual asset goal is. And I see that he needs to access a couple of different things. That is the basic research and a web page. So this web page, if I go out on my network here, I get a different view of my network topology. I see his computer here, and I see the internal network. And then over here, I see, pardon my use with this Mac interface. It's not my usual. So over here is the web, and in fact, this web server over here contains the asset that our guy Larry needs to access. And he doesn't have any connectivity to that. So the student is going to get a whole bunch of help from the game because this is an introductory scenario. And you see these pop-ups come up telling him to buy a router. So the students can purchase a number of different things, and what they can purchase is dependent on what the scenario designer has put into the catalog. And so he's just going to buy a simple router and drop that router on Larry's desk or any place he wants. So then I go back to my network screen, and I'm going to select that router, and I'm going to hook it up to the internet. And then I'm going to hook that router also to the internal network. And that's simply, just as simply, a player can connect an enterprise to the internet, even if they've never really worked with a router in their life. So I restart the simulation, and he's going to stop pounding the keyboard, and now I'm making money. And so what this is showing is that we've integrated the network simulation with a game economy so that the scenario is able to punish you essentially if you're not providing access to the assets and reward you if you are. So I'm going to restart that. He's happy, I'm making money, but of course I've not really taken a look at that router to see what kind of traffic I'm allowing into the enterprise. And sure enough, some kid on the internet has corrupted my research database. We have an online help facility, so if I press F1, we have context-sensitive help that tells us about what network filters are, tells us about various computer security devices and how they relate to the game. So what I'm seeing right now is one of the scenario elements that was in that list, and I'm going to go back to that list that we saw before and actually show you how the games are, or how this particular scenario is put together. But this is an example of a trigger that pops up. So in the scenario design, one of the things the designer can do is use these programmable triggers to provide the student with very specific interaction based on the conditions that are current in the game. Okay, so he's been attacked. If I go and I double-click on this router, which is what I would learn if I read the encyclopedia page, not that the student is going to read very much, but they'll start clicking on things, and things like this will pop up, and they'll see a representation of a simple network filter. Here we have different network connections, the internet and the internal LAN, directions, and then a number of services. And I see out of the box that all the services are allowed from the internet, and so that explains why bad things happened. Before I do something about that, I'll make believe I'm a curious student and go back to the network and maybe make believe I read a bit about the game. And so one of the things I can do is learn about the effects of this filter being wide open by going out onto the internet and then simulating the running of a port scan on the enterprise that I'm dealing with. So here I have the output of a port scan on the tire ply business. I can see Larry's computer, and I can see for whatever reason Larry has decided to, or somebody has decided to put a web server on Larry's computer. And down here I see that the web server is an old patch level and vulnerable to exploitation. I could go in and I could try to patch Larry's computer, or I could get rid of that application, but since Larry is the boss's son, I'm not actually able to touch his computer in this scenario. And that's one of the aspects of scenario design that turns out to be fairly important, in that there's a lot of ways to solve problems sometimes, particularly in the simulation. It's a fairly broad simulation. And so one of the challenges in scenario design is to corral the student and force the student into an alley where they make choices that are relevant to the topic that you're trying to teach them. And so if patching was important, I'd put that in a patching scenario. And of course, we have those as well, but this is a filter scenario, so you have to deal with filters. So I'll go back and quite simply deny all unsolicited service requests from the internet and save my friend Larry from having his research corrupted. So this ticker down at the bottom that you've seen in the pop-ups, that's more examples of the programmable triggers that I mentioned earlier. So the scenario designer can find these game conditions and then add filler or humor or attempts at humor. One of the things I didn't show you is we maintain an attack log. So when the student's network is attacked, they can go back and read about what happened, and they can actually see sort of a trace route that shows the path that the attacker took in to get to the asset. The attack log, just like the network scan, that's all built into the underlying network simulation. So the scenario designer doesn't have to add those things. Those are all just part of the game engine. Okay, so I'm going to continue the scenario here. So he's still happy, I'm still making money, and of course I'm not being attacked, at least at the moment, because I've blocked all that web access. One of the trigger types that's included in the game engine is multiple choice quizzes. So you can create arbitrary multiple choice quizzes, and the student can go and try a number of different answers until they get the right one. And all of this interaction that the student does is logged in the game. And so we have detailed logs and tools for analyzing the logs to see what it is the students have done. And you can potentially use those logs to figure out if they're learning. So where are we now? He's surfed the web now, and so I think we're going to move on to the next phase. And so sure enough, I've now introduced a new user, and this new user is going to have a different goal. And that brings me to our objective screen, which is one of the other major parts of scenario design, at least in CyberCIEGE, and that is to sort of split things up so that the student has some sense of purpose and direction and accomplishment as they move from one phase to another. So I'm now in phase 3, and my objective at this point is to facilitate Mary's access to something called the STEAL formula. And if I read this, I see that she's going to start working on this formula on whatever computer is handy. That's going to be her own computer. And this is giving me a hint right now that I might want to learn something about the STEAL formula. And this begins to introduce the student into the issue of policy. That is, not all assets are created equal. Not everything is Larry's silly research database or his web access. Some things might be extremely valuable. And so I'm directed to look at the asset screen, and I've got some of that pop-up help coming here. So if I select the STEAL formula, I see that it's actually got a proprietary label associated with it in this enterprise. They call it car tire design. And stuff with this proprietary label I see is my most sensitive corporate information, and my competitors might spend millions of dollars or more to get their hands on it. I see down here that I've got high background checks for people who I trust with this information. So this is very different from the earlier asset that Larry was working with. This is something that somebody's actually going to spend a lot of money to try to get their hands on. So if I go back to my network topology, I see here's Mary's computer, and if I click on it, if I just click on it and click on it. Okay, so there's Mary again, and this computer contains the STEAL formula. She's starting to work on it, and if I start up my simulation, she's happy, she's got her asset, it's on her computer, she's working, things are good, and one of these triggers that the scenario designer has put in the scenario fires and asks what happens if a Trojan horse sitting on her computer wants to send the STEAL formula out to the internet. How do I stop that? So the student can fret about that. The student can introduce a second firewall. Sometimes they'll add a third firewall. They'll try to re-image Mary's computer, add antivirus, and they'll work on that for a number of iterations, and then eventually they're going to go in and they're going to select Mary's computer and they're going to take it off the network, realizing that Mary doesn't need access to the network in order to work on this very valuable asset. Oh, if I launch off again, she's happy. And so part of what this is illustrating, again, is the notion of policy that some assets are different from other assets, and you have to think a little more systematically about the overall security problem. Okay, so I've done well there. I get one more multiple choice quiz. And I believe that this one is B as well. Let's see, if I click that one, I get an answer that tells me why that's not the correct answer, or at least not the answer that the scenario designer is looking for. And so there's the correct answer. Okay, and then the scenario moves on to another phase in which I have an off-site government employee that needs access to some data on the corporate web server, and I need to poke a hole in the firewall to make that happen. But we won't dwell on that. What I'd like to do is circle back to the tool and play the scenario again and just talk a bit about some of the elements of the scenario, how it was actually put together. Okay, so if I start it up again, back again to the first thing we were dealing with, and that is our guy Larry and his goals. So if I look at the scenario design, which I cannot reach, there it is. So here's my set of users within this scenario. And some of you can read that. So if I bring that up, I have the simple form that describes Larry. I see what groups he's in, but most importantly, here I see the goal that the scenario designer has given Larry, and that is something called web and basic research. He's going to spend 50% of his time on it. Some of his happiness is derived from that, and all of his productivity is derived from that. So fairly that simply, I've defined a user, I've given him a goal, and here's the description that the player sees of the user when he goes in, looking for descriptions of who the user is. So I can then learn about that goal, and that is here, web basic research. And so here I see the description of the goal that the player sees. Here I have a availability penalty, and this is part of the game economy, in which I'm saying the player is going to be losing a lot of money, $500,000 a month, I think that is, if the user cannot access that goal. And then down here I see the definition of the goal itself, and that is in terms of the assets that have got to be reached. So the web page has got to be accessed through a filtered software type. And so what this means is that if something interferes with web server traffic that's sitting between where Larry is and the web page that contains the asset, he's still going to be unable to achieve his goals. So the practical effect of that is, for example, if I had blocked web access going out of the enterprise with that filter, if I'd blocked web access traffic, he would not have been able to achieve that goal. And then this tells me I also have to access the asset called basic research. I'll next look at the basic research asset. And again, fairly simply, I just have a description of what that asset is. It has an availability penalty associated with it as well. But down here is the important bits, and that is the cost list. So what this says is if anybody in the public writes to this asset, it's going to cost me $1,000. And here I see that the attacker is motivated with a value of 55 to attack that asset. Our motives range from 0 to 1,000, somewhat of a log scale. And so 55 is a relatively low motive. 2 minutes. Okay. Actually, I think that's most of what I wanted to show. I'll show you a quick trigger. So these are the programmable triggers. This one is what happens when it fires when the research asset was attacked. Here, this turns out to be a message trigger. Here's the message that's displayed. And then down here, I have the conditions under which the trigger fires, and that is simply whenever the research is attacked. Okay. I think I'm running low on time, so I'd like to open it up to questions on the game. And I know there's a lot of aspects of the game that I wasn't able to cover in the short period of time, but I'd be happy to answer any of those questions if you have them now.
Hi, Jonathan from Carnegie Mellon. So in your experience, what properties make a scenario a good scenario versus a not helpful scenario from your experience?
I think the main thing is the ability to have consequential choices where the student can make a choice and see the effects of that, see that good things happen or bad things happen. So if they can, if the scenario gives them the opportunity to make choices where they see good things or bad things happening, and there's a context in which they can, some kind of storyline so that when they make that choice, they see the user's unhappy for whatever reason and that it makes sense in some context. And so I think the good scenarios are ones that give you a sense of context, let you see the effects of your choices, and then let you go back and experiment.
Very cool, thanks.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for showing demo. It's really always helpful to see these things in motion. My question's about your comment about students replaying to see the consequences of their actions. Given the log data that you've seen from students using it, do you get a sense of where the healthy medium is? Because I imagine endlessly replaying might be a sign of some sort of psychological disorder. So like where's the fun balance where it's like, oh, they replayed it X% of the time?
It's kind of all over the map, but I've not really seen replaying the same scenario more than, say, half a dozen times. And sometimes they'll focus on just one particular aspect of the scenario. Some students will just go through the scenario once, and some of them, of course, will figure it out right away and work through it. The logs that I like looking at the best are the ones that figure it out pretty quickly and then go back and try things that break, and deliberately looking at things that are not going to work and hypothesizing, what kind of attack is going to happen if I leave myself vulnerable this way.